Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Hard Truth. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had an awesome week this week because you're awesome people. Listen, in my last video, I hypothesized that Brian's condescending attitude may have come off as threatening to some people in law enforcement. Well, I stand by my condescending part, but after checking some things, it may not be law enforcement who was actually threatened. I'm going to show you what I mean. So grab that coffee or a nice cup of tea as we begin our story. There are only three sins in the world: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And in this case, I believe that the culprit is the pride of life. Kohlberger's application to Pullman PD was in April of 2022. So if they felt threatened by his tone of superiority, I don't think he would have been selected for the TA position at WSU. On the contrary, perhaps they were impressed and hopeful, and his application actually helped him. Maybe they even referred him to WSU when they found out he was applying to the university. So who would feel threatened enough to offer him up as a suspect if it wasn't somebody in law enforcement? Well, I think we need to look at the only place that we can find any imperfection in this super student, Brian's record in Washington. This article was published in the Inside Edition on February the 14th, 2023. And it says faculty members were counseling Brian Kohlberger after a verbal altercation between the teacher's assistant and the professor he worked for in the school's criminology program, while also probing his conduct with female students. So they're really laying it on here. Not only was he having problems with his professor, but female students were accusing him of something. Okay? It says, it is unclear that if Kohlberger had made the decision to leave WSU's criminology program before he drove back to Pennsylvania on December 13th, but search warrants executed at Kohlberger's on-campus residence and office both turned up little in the way of evidence, according to authorities. This is not true. If he left everything in his apartment, then common sense he was coming back. I think it's not unclear if he made a decision to leave, and if it was his decision, WSU had not yet terminated him. So this paragraph tells us a lot that, number one, they're not being honest about whether or not he had been fired yet, because he wouldn't have left his stuff if he was not coming back. And then down here, it gets into the allegations. On September 23rd, you had an altercation with the faculty you support as a TA, Professor Snyder. I met with you on October 3rd to discuss norms of professional behavior. On October 21st, Professor Snyder emailed you about the ways in which you had failed to meet your expectations as a TA thus far in the semester. It continues. As a result, on November 2nd, Graduate Director Dale Willits and I met with you to discuss an improvement plan, which you agreed to, and I shared with you in an email dated November the 3rd. Kohlberger met the faculty, including the professor with whom he allegedly had conflicts, and the graduate director on December the 7th. So this problem escalated from October the 3rd. It just, continued on until finally the graduate director was brought in. And I'm just wondering what Kohlberger could have been saying to this professor to where it was causing problems. And this is where my hypothesis comes in. And again, this is just a hypothesis. I'm not directly accusing anyone of anything. This is strictly my opinion, and this video is strictly for entertainment. All right? We're going to take a look at this because it's very, very revealing. But then on December 9th, there was another altercation with Professor Snyder in which it became apparent that you had not made progress regarding professionalism, and about which I wrote to you on December 11th requesting a meeting. We met on December 19th when I informed you of your termination as a TA for spring semester. And we know by December 19th, he was back in Pennsylvania. So maybe they met by Zoom. I'm not sure. But by December the 19th, Brian obviously wasn't backing down on whatever problem he was having with the professor. It escalated. And on top of that, there were accusations by some young ladies that were in his class. Okay? Allegations. Administrators probed the allegations made by Koberger's female students, including that he once followed a young woman to her car but found no evidence of wrongdoing. So he's being accused here of misconduct, and since that may not be enough, let's put the student accusations in there, okay? I mean, the university really didn't have a choice but to fire him if you think of both of these things at the same time. All right, so let's take a look at the professor. Let's take a look at Professor Snyder's reviews. And I'm not going to read too much of this. I'll give you a link if you want to read over it yourself. I'm just going to give you what I took away from it. The first thing I noticed is that he has the lowest rating out of all of the professors in the department, a 4 out of 5. If you look down here, one professor had a perfect 5, and one had a 4.6, and the other had a 4.1. So he had the lowest rating. And another thing is some of these comments, these are from April 2023. This is after Brian, okay? It says, very chill guy, lectures are interesting, but he doesn't really talk about the actual book much, all right? He tries to bring out a lot of real life scenarios. Class is pretty easy, just a lot of online quizzes. Okay, what I took away from these is that he's not very technology savvy. It's like he's become too old school. He doesn't know how to work some of the technology probably. And so let's just keep going. You'll see what I mean. All right, this is April 23rd. Very chill guy. Lectures are interesting, but he doesn't really talk about the actual book much. He tries to bring a lot of real life scenarios into it. This was after Brian, okay? His level of difficulty, his class is a 2.0, and that's pretty consistent throughout all of these. I mean, very few people gave him more than a 2 as far as difficulty. This says lectures are not really structured. He basically just talked about whatever he wrote down on a notepad, but his stories were interesting. Both our midterm and final were taken online. We could read the textbook and answer questions. Only had a few essays. Overall, he was everybody says he's a pretty nice guy. But we're looking at, we're looking for his performance as a professor, and his ability to, teach the class. Look here, December the 17th, 2022. This is when he was arguing back and forth with Brian. It says, the course outline was not followed at all. We were supposed to have 4 exams, including the final, but instead had only one prior to the final, making the final worth 325 points. Also, he does not inform you when assignments are due. The lack of structure makes it very hard to complete coursework when sick and in general. Again, difficulty 2.0. Okay, he did get a 5 August 22nd, which is only a few weeks into the class, so I guess they know. All right, this is April the 27th, 2022. have seen a lot of great reviews for this professor, but I have had a terrible experience. When I attended his office hours, he belittled me and offered no help. Absolutely no communication between what? The TA and the professor. Some assignments were tough and some were super easy. Everything got postponed and had no set due date, plus unclear expectations. Okay, this was the spring before Brian got there. It said no communication between the TA and professor, absolutely none. Okay, so he was having problems, as an instructor that had nothing to do with Brian Koberger, and so I'm imagining that they were falling out over his methods. Okay, they seemed a bit outdated. Okay, he wasn't using PowerPoint or whatever. He got another 5. This was April 2022. And then when you go back, it looks like in 21 he was doing well. But in 2022, things went downhill. All right. Snyder tells great stories. Lectures are not super informational, but they are still worth attending. But you could not go and be fine. He is a great person in general. That's because he doesn't require you to come to class. All right. Level of difficulty of 1. So, I mean, we're seeing a picture of, the class from these comments. All right. It's just pretty obvious. Look, I never used the textbook. I never used the textbook. So we got people saying no PowerPoint, no notes. He's not using a textbook. He's just telling stories. All right, this is December the 3rd. Snyder is one of the best professors. Although he does not like to use PowerPoint or provide notes for his lectures, he's easy to keep up with. Exams are based on book content, and he makes sure to provide a thorough exam review guide where he basically lets you know exactly what's on the exam. I mean, it's just, I can see where him and Brian were having problems. And I can also see where Brian would come in using PowerPoint, Excel, you know, digital notes, new technology. And that had to be intimidating for the professor. All right. This was in 2020. Does not even have notes or slideshows. Lecture is him just talking about court cases he has worked. Assumes everybody already knows everything about criminal justice in a 101 class. Snyder is nice and understanding, but you have to do most of your own work. So everybody says he's a nice guy, he's likable, but you're graded by a few things. He's not using the technology, he's just telling stories about he's teaching out of his experiences, which is nothing wrong with that, but that can't be 80 or 90% of the course. And so I can see where he and Brian would bump heads, and I can also see where he can want Brian to go on about his business. All right? What do you think about this one? Lastly, I want to talk about the many articles published that state Brian Koberger changed license plates on his white Hyundai Elantra days after the Idaho murders. This particular article says license plates on the 2015 Hyundai Elantra at the center of the murder inquiry were registered in Washington state just days after quadruple homicide. And this was published Sunday, January the 8th, 2023. Nowhere in the requirements did it say that Brian Koberger had to apply with the police department or go with some job after he finishes his degree. He didn't have to do that. Okay, that's not true. And then here's another thing that's not true. Let's look at the residency. All right, this is the criminal justice and criminology department. It's not just the whole school, it's his department funding. Here it says residency under the assistantships. To qualify for resident tuition, state law requires you be a state resident for 12 months. If you are a U.S. citizen or permanent resident and have come to WSU from out of state, establish residency in order to avoid paying out-of-state tuition. To establish residency, get your Washington State driver's license within 30 days of arrival, register your car, register to vote, establish a bank account, and live in state for 1 year. And they give 1 year of waiver for the assistant, the teacher assistant. And after that 1 year, they charge you if you haven't changed your tags. So him changing his tags in November was, number one, his birthday is in November. He had to do it then. And number two, he had to, or he would lose his money for the following school year. All right. It says out-of-state tuition is waived for the first year until the student establishes residency. And if he hadn't changed his tags and registration for his car over, he would not be eligible for the same amount of money in the upcoming year. So this fallacy that he ran and changed his tags because they had some white car on surveillance cameras, and there was no tag in the front or whatever, it's not true. He had to do it, and so let's move on.